It's great to be here with you all, and I want to thank AIAA for the opportunity to take part in this discussion this afternoon. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Kelvin Coleman, and I am the Deputy Associate Administrator for Commercial Space Transportation at the Federal Aviation Administration. So today, what we're going to do in part two of this discussion is talk about commercial human spaceflight, and specifically, this part of the session is dedicated to private industry companies that are developing systems intended to carry humans into space, both orbital and suborbital, and talk about basic rocket designs, operations, their development schedules, and objectives of their systems, including the propulsion development and business cases will be addressed during this part of the session. Additionally, status of arrangements, insurance, and licensing of safety of flight operations, both for flight members and third-party public, will be discussed. First, let me start by saying for over 50 years, human spaceflight was something that was nearly exclusively carried out by governments. But those monumental feats have inspired a crop of entrepreneurs to test the boundaries of physics and the imagination, to attempt to design, build, and operate commercial vehicles that would eventually carry people into space. In 2004, the Ansari X Prize was awarded to Scale Composites for launching the first non-government crewed spacecraft into space twice within 2 weeks. In fact, my office issued the first set of commercial astronaut wings to pilots Mike Melville and Brian Benny for becoming the first non-government astronauts. In those 15 years since, we have seen the dawn of a new era in space, one that's characterized by multiple players working to bring people to and from space. From suborbital space tourism and science research flights to orbital flights, to the International Space Station, we are seeing the birth and evolution of some of the most innovative systems in space exploration to date. So let me talk about a little bit about the FAA and give you a little bit of perspective from the regulatory, in terms of regulatory context. My office primarily launches its license and reentry operations. And in 2004, with the passage of the Commercial Space Launch Amendments Act by Congress, our office was given clear authority to regulate commercial human spaceflight. But in order for this new burgeoning industry to grow and develop, Congress restricted us from issuing new regulations that were designed to protect the people on board commercial vehicles. Instead, an 8-year learning period was established. Many of you may have heard of this or referred to as the moratorium. During this moratorium, operators have continued to develop capabilities, but were also required to inform spaceflight participants and crew about the hazards and risks associated with their spaceflight. Each occupant of a commercial space vehicle is required to sign an informed consent document acknowledging that they understand that they're choosing to fly on a vehicle that has not been certified by the government and that they are doing it at their own personal risk. The moratorium has continued, and currently it has been extended to October the 1st, 2023. Now, I'm happy to report that industry is well on its way to bringing humans to and from space, and that's what we're here to talk about for this part of the panel. I'm joined here by a group of folks who are on the cutting edge of this commercial human spaceflight arena. With me here today is Chris Allison, who is a senior systems engineer at the Sierra Nevada Corporation, Hans Koenigsmann, who is the vice president of mission assurance at SpaceX, and Peter McGrath, who is the director of global sales and marketing at Boeing. We'll talk about the systems of each of these companies, and what they're designing and building to carry humans into space, what their development schedules look like, and what challenges they face. I'll give each of our panelists an opportunity to give you an overview of their activities, and then we'll go into Q&A. And as pointed out here on the screen, you can submit your questions to aiaa.cnf.io. So without further ado, we'll turn it over to Chris.
Thank you. So I just have a couple charts here. It's a lot of pictures for everybody, so not a lot of reading coming up here. Just want to give you guys an overview of what we're working on at Sierra Nevada. There'll be some highlights in here of the Dream Chaser program, as well as some of our activities with Lunar Gateway as we move forward as well. Just a little bit about myself. So I am a systems engineer, work Dream Chaser primarily, but within S&C we're structured in a way that we have an advanced programs group as well. And within that group is where we start looking at other diverse applications of Dream Chaser type technology into a lot of other opportunities, both commercially and on the government side. And then I work quite a bit with the FAA office as well to license Dream Chaser to be able to land our vehicle back at runways all over the world. So we have a lot of work to do there, and it's a learning curve every day, but we're working through the challenges as a team together and appreciate the support of the office. So I represent our space systems group. So Sierra Nevada Full Enterprise does a lot of different things outside of the space industry. Within space, we have 4 major focus areas. Space exploration systems, and that's where the presentation today will primarily focus. That's our development of Dream Chaser, as well as our deep space habitat programs and our commercial cargo service for NASA resupply to ISS. We have a space technologies group. We do a lot of smaller systems, pointing and motion control adapters, separation systems. We source parts out to quite a few of your companies here in the audience for different mission support. We do spacecraft system as well. This is small satellites, some small geosatellites, ESPA compatible type satellites. And then we also have propulsion environmental systems in our office that's in Madison, Wisconsin. So the propulsion that's on Dream Chaser is being provided by our propulsion division, that's RCS thrusters, and then our environmental control systems as well. So systems that we use to provide a habitable environment to humans on board the vehicle and when we're berthed to ISS. So a little bit about Dream Chaser. So we are a runway landing space vehicle, as I mentioned. You see we have the 2 main gears and then a nose skid. And the pictures that you see here show the 2 variants of the vehicle. The white one on top is our crew version of the vehicle, and then the one without windows, bottom right corner, that's our cargo version of the vehicle. So it's no secret that we were part of the competition moving forward with the commercial crew program. My colleagues here were awarded those contracts and we were not. So we took that time to kind of really pivot our design and focus on the cargo aspects of the vehicle. Which you see in the bottom right here, and we added the cargo module. And this is allowing us to move forward with the program, retire a lot of risk as we start to also look at the evolution of Dream Chaser to crew capability. So kind of looking back on it, hindsight's 2020, and I think there were some good opportunities for us to optimize certain parts of the vehicle, grow capability in other areas that we were blind to at the time that we were developing the crew vehicles. So I think it's a good opportunity for us. Some of the key features of the vehicle, non-toxic propulsion that we use on the vehicle. So when we land back on the runway, and this is part of our larger integration strategy into integrating more into the network of airports and spaceports within the US and the world globally, is being able to approach the vehicle more rapidly, not disrupt or create significant hazards within the workflow of these other operating sites. Our G profile, because we can control the attitude of the vehicle on reentry, is relatively low, and we have a significant cross-range capability, meaning that from a particular orbit, we can land at a lot of different sites. So we have a lot of flexibility there, which gives us a lot of operational capabilities moving forward. And we're launch vehicle agnostic, so we're designed to launch on top of any rocket, so we don't handle that side of getting off the Earth. We deal with the mission on orbit and then getting back to Earth. So, as I mentioned, quite a few pictures. So where are we on the Dream Chaser progress? So we are well past our critical design review at this point, and we are in the midst of AIAA, so assembly, integration, and test. So you can see here photos of several different components. So we have in the upper left corner, you see 2 photos of our pressurized volume of Dream Chaser. It's all composite, the outer aeroshells. Lockheed Martin's helping us develop that currently. As we move across the top, you see a big conical shape there. That's our first cargo module. all this hardware is en route and going to be delivered to our facility in Colorado for assembly. And you can see various avionics components here that we have, and we have testing in our laboratories right now at our facility. Bottom left corner, you can see our mission control center that we've developed in Colorado. So Dream Chaser will be flown and operated out of our Colorado Mission Control Center. So we're excited about that. And looking at the inside of the vehicle, we did some demonstration tests or demonstrations for NASA, showing the cargo that we can fit inside the vehicle, how we integrate powered lockers, passive cargo, those kind of things. You can see our cargo integration team here in the middle upper photo. Very excited to be inside of a mock-up of a spaceship. And you can see in the bottom middle there, the team that we have in Colorado working on this moving forward. On the launch vehicle note, I will mention too, we had an exciting announcement last week. So for our first 6 flights for the NASA cargo resupply missions, we are moving forward with the ULA Vulcan rocket. So we announced that last week. So there's videos of that press conference online at our Louisville facility if that's of interest to anybody. And the last chart that I have is just to mention how, so we're developing Dream Chaser for cargo capability right now. We're looking at expanding that to human capability moving forward, and we're keeping that design in mind every time we make a design decision on the cargo variant, is what is our path to crew, how do we upgrade to crew. But in parallel to that, and in the advanced programs or advanced development team that I mentioned earlier, we're also looking at applications beyond just the Dream Chaser direct product line. So leveraging technology from that focus. And right now we have a contract with NASA, and we call it the Life Elements, a large inflatable fabric environment. This is photos of it, a full-scale representation or full-scale mock-up in our facility in Colorado. It was too tall to fit in the building, so we had to dig a hole that it could fit in. It's 25 or 27 feet in diameter. It will have 3 floors in it, which in space is actually like 4 floors, right? Because there's no up or down. About 300 cubic meters of pressurized volume, and will allow for 4 crew habitation. It is designed to support 1,100 day Mars class mission. Right now, this prototype is no longer in our facility in Colorado. We have moved it down to Johnson Space Center, where NASA is performing human factors testing on it. So we've had several groups of astronauts that have gone through, giving us feedback on the human factors side of it, the layout, but a lot of the feedback that we're getting at this point is very positive for this particular item. I think that's my last chart. Just wanted to kind of give everybody a status of where we are and what we're looking at moving forward.
All right. Well, great. Thank you, Chris. We appreciate that. And next, we'll go to Hans, talk about what SpaceX is doing.
All right, thank you. And still good morning, I guess. I'm going to talk briefly about, mostly Crew Dragon and the vehicles developed to fly the capsule. This is a picture of Crew Dragon approaching the stage. I didn't do anything. Okay, so this actually is the launch, the Demo 1 launch earlier, and I think it was early March this year. 4 people inside the capsule, nobody on board on this particular flight. This is the second mission control room. We have a launch control room, rather, and a mission control room back in Hawthorne. This is the mission control room, and it's a fish tank, so you can see from the outside what people are doing. It's a view inside the capsule, looking down at the launch pad. It got a remarkable amount of attention at that time. Second stage ignition.
Stage separation confirmed.
Sorry, it's so quiet. And then the booster, of course, lands forward, in this case, on a drone ship in pretty rough seas, actually. Successfully recovered. This is the Dragon separation seen from the second stage. Dragon seen from the station. One difference between Crew Dragon and the Cargo Dragon version is that Crew Dragon is a docking vehicle, and that view of the station is a lot more impressive when you dock than rather berth, as we usually did. I love this picture in particular. It's really great. And docking is also a lot faster than the berthing event that we had.
On behalf of Ripley,
All right. There you go, Little Earth. Little Earth is still on the station. It's going to be picked up by the next flight.
Houston, station on suit. ISS crew is ready for departure. Separation visually confirmed.
The nose cone closes for landing again. These are Doug and Bob, the first two astronauts.
We have 4 south chute. Recover this is to receive. Dragon has landed.
And successful landing. In this case also, there's a couple of firsts here, and I'm sorry, it was a little bit fast. I didn't want to run the video right away. So we developed Crew Dragon over the last couple of years. We had another variant, basically Cargo Dragon earlier. Cargo Dragon has flown to the station by now, I want to say 18 times. And one thing that we learned over these 18 flights is that you do need a certain routine to become, I want to say, professional and reliable and safe. And the first couple of vehicles are usually there to work out details in your systems, make sure that everything is improved and safe as you go along. And that particular factor, doing stuff over and over again, is really not to be underestimated. I've learned over the last 75 flights that we had on Falcon 9 that it's a really important factor to refly things, to actually fly them, look at the data, and then see where something was on the corner or has very little margin or not sufficient margin, and then work these improvements into the system. That is an incredible important factor. And one factor that's also important in this whole situation is reusability. Reusability not only gives you a lower cost on the whole system per se, so we can be able to lower the launch cost, and it's true for both Falcon and for Dragon. It also gives you the ability to actually look at something after the flight and find out whether there was a little leak here or whether there's more water and connectors and all these little things, all these details that make spaceflight so incredibly difficult. You actually have a chance to look at them and not just try to deduce what actually happened from data. So I saw reusability originally only as a commercial aspect, but my opinion on this changed. It's actually a reliability aspect. It has become a reliability aspect. And if you think about this, one of the things that we do every day in many, many thousand variants is flying big airplanes that are complex, and we do this very, very safely. And it's partly because we're actually able to just land and look at the data and look at the hardware and see where things don't quite work, where things chafe, and where things have contact and do bad things. We're able to work those out and actually make this over many, many years and over many, many flights very, very reliable. And that's, in my opinion, for spaceflight and going forward, in particular with human spaceflight, that is a very important aspect and incredibly important to just have this routine and the immense amount of launches one after the other. We have recovered so far 44 first stages, and actually several of these multiple times. There's several that have flown 3 times so far, and we recovered actually more at sea than 26 at sea and 18 on land. Actually, I think this number is wrong. I think I made a mistake. This is 45. But either way, 44, 45 doesn't really matter here. It's a fairly high number, and it's increasing with every launch we do, almost every launch. We have flown 25 of these recovered boosters again, and we will continue to do so. I could see and witness basically the change in our customers from, I would say, a little bit of skepticism in the beginning of flying a recovered booster, a previously flown vehicle, as we call it, to we actually like that. You have done all the tests, you know this vehicle. Yeah? And from my perspective, my group runs the launch chief engineers, and I've been launch chief engineer for a long time myself. I really like actually having a booster, because all I do is I go back to the last flight, I look at the list of any enormous events, if there are any, and I know the booster actually. If I get a new booster, I have to go back and look at certain acceptance tests, and so on and so forth to get a better idea of that particular booster and the flight rationale. So there's a definitive benefit on reusability connected to human spaceflight and making this whole event safe as possible. I did want to share another video, which is pretty recent. We started looking at recovering fairings a while back, and like recovering the first stages, it had its ups and downs in the beginning. You need to work those things out, but we're actually at the point now where they land on the boat. And the last mission we had was AIMO 17, had an incredible landing on a fairing on a boat, and that's what I have here. It's once the video runs. Thank you. It's almost unreal how the fairing comes from the top and lands right in the middle of that net. There you go. That's it. That's how you save a fairing. And you inspect it, you refurbish it in some parts, and you fly it again. And that actually brings me to another point. It's just not reusability. It's also important to have rapid reusability. It's the fact that you do not bring this back into the factory and strip it down and put new things in and then fly it again. You might as well build a new one, right? So that's not the point. No, you bring this back to the launch site, you inspect it just to be sure, and the number of inspections obviously goes down as you build a database, as you gain experience on where are your weaknesses and where are your strengths, and you can either fix your weaknesses or it's a trait in all these cases. And the goal basically is to take this fairing, I want to say, walk around it, make sure it's healthy, and then put it together on the next flight. And the same is true for first stages, long term, going into Starship and other vehicles. This will also be true for second stages. So I feel like the connection between reusability, human spaceflight, super important to get this done right, super important to get this done in a commercially advantageous way, in other words, lower cost, and at the same time increasing reliability as much as you can. I think this is my last slide. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I do have, well, these come later, I guess.
Yeah, we'll take questions.
So I may just skip over this. So I had Mars and Moon just to make my point.
All right, well, thank you very much, Hans. We appreciate that. We will get to a few questions momentarily. So, but before we do that, we'll go to Peter McGrath, talk a little bit about what Boeing's doing.
Thank you very much for having me here today. So I'm going to give you a little status of where we're at getting Starliner to first flight, which actually is a real exciting time. Matter of fact, I think Chris Ferguson was going to be here originally, but he's so tied up in training that I get to stand in for him today. So you get a former structural engineer / sales guy instead of an astronaut. I apologize, but I'll stand in today. I do start off with a video as well. I think we're all videos these days.
At this point, we are witnessing something that we're all going to remember decades from now. This is a point in history that reflects a new era in human spaceflight.
So as I mentioned, it's an exciting time. It's, when you see the hardware all coming together down at the Cape and you see preparations underway for first flight, it's amazing to look back at the several years of development effort and the progress that's been made. Just an overview of our ConOps, we talk about this a lot. We do launch on an Atlas V. I'll talk a little more about that in a couple charts. We then approach station. As said, the nice thing about commercial crew is you actually dock versus berthing. We have a lot of legacy with that. I don't know if you remember, we did Orbital Express several years ago where we actually had 2 satellites where we docked them in space, separated them, brought them back together, transferred fuel, did a couple other things with it. So we have a lot of heritage on actually docking systems in space. So that's applied into what we're doing with our Starliner. It will dock with station. Nominally, it will be there for about 6 months. I think the first flight's going to be up for a couple of days and then come back down for the orbital flight test. We do deorbit it. The service module would separate. One unique feature is we do land. That is our baseline. We have 5 landing sites. Our primary is at White Sands. We land with airbags on a very controlled landing surface. Whenever I saw one land, it's almost like a chip shot on a green. So it's very controlled. And then we actually bring it back through the assembly and refurbishment, and we actually reuse the capsules. So it's a true reusable spacecraft. So that's our ConOps. And one thing I'll add is our flight operations is done in partnership with NASA through the Flight Operations Directorate at JSC. And so we leverage them for all the flight operations aspects. When you look at the vehicle, I'll start on the rocket side. Very legacy Atlas V. Matter of fact, 80 successful flights to date without an anomaly. It has been modified for 2 things. We've added an emergency detection system that really monitors the health of the rocket and tells the vehicle if it's time to abort or not. We also use a dual-engine Centaur, albeit not a baseline right now on Atlas. It has flown legacy Atlas flights over the years. It gives you a nice redundancy in terms of the propulsion systems. We have a new skirt that handles the buffet loads and the acoustic loads that come off, and then the Starliner sits on top. As for the Starliner, several key elements, but the key one is, like I said, a reusable crew module that can fly 10 times. And then a service module. We have several in production. I'll show you some pictures from that as well. So these are spacecraft flight pictures. And I'll tell you, when I saw this, I took a step back on the middle one. And I'll talk about that one for a minute. Orbital flight test, it doesn't look as mature as the other ones. That's only because all the panels were on it. It went to a testing out in El Segundo, and then it came back, and we took the panels off, and then we were checking out all the systems before we send it over to the Atlas facility for integration. All the panels are back on, and now it's over at the integration facility. So we're making real good progress on getting the orbital flight test vehicle to the pad and ready to go. You can see the service module at the bottom. The one on the left is the pad abort vehicle. That's the one that will go to White Sands test range, and we'll do a pad abort test. And then the one on the far right is the first crewed vehicle that will fly Nicole Mann and Mike Fink and Chris Ferguson to space station. The sequence, just to give you the sequence, because I know this question comes up, we're heading towards an orbital flight test here in October. More than likely, the pad abort test will happen shortly after that, and then we'll fly the crew flight test vehicle primarily when NASA's ready, because that's the one nice thing about crewed flight is we can say we're ready, but until NASA's ready, we won't be flying it. These are all based on when they're safe to fly, not when we're driving to flight, so that's our focus. Launch vehicle production, a lot of good progress. The first vehicle is at the facility down at KSC. The second vehicle is in production and heading that way soon. So we're making very good progress. Matter of fact, our ULA friends are in the audience today, and they can probably talk as much as I can about it. But we're making steady progress on the vehicle side as well. One thing I talk about a lot, one of the questions is, matter of fact, maybe I'll steal the question you were going to ask me here. What's my biggest fear to getting to flight? It's getting through testing, really. And part of our test philosophy, when you look at it, is we do a lot of what I call inline testing. So we test at the subsystem level, then at the system level, and then we'll do a total integrated test at some point. And by doing that, hopefully you drive down risk earlier in the process. So if you have an issue, it's normally worked out at the lower level system tests, so that by the time you get to an integrated system, you don't have an issue of a significant event happening or something that draws long duration delays. So this is really our philosophy. What you see here is structural load testing on the left. The hot fire test, which is where we did have an anomalous condition where a valve was left open and we actually expended the whole hypergalls. And we had to rework the valve and got that back on the test stand and had a very successful test here about 2-3 months ago. The environmental testing, that was what I was talking about down in El Segundo at our facility. And then the parachute testing, we've completed all of our parachute tests with no issues or anomalies, so we're ready to move forward to flight. The only thing we have left is orbital flight test, pad abort test, and crewed flight. In terms of mission operations, what you see is a lot of launch preps. Matter of fact, I think they showed a picture this past week of going down the escape runs at the Falcon pad. We've been doing the same thing out at the Atlas pad. Matter of fact, we use a zipline company not too far from, I think, you guys in Colorado that actually manufacture that for us. It's quite an experience. Matter of fact, we typically have a line for people who want to try it. But it's a good zip line event down from the tower. We've been working through that. You see the flight operations. We've been doing a lot of full rehearsals, both with nominal flight as well as any anomalous conditions that we're preparing for. They've been running through wet dress rehearsals and everything on the flight controls. We've done emergency escape training. I mentioned we're land landing, but we are designed to land in the water if we have to on an abort sequence. And so we do both water egress as well as you see at the bottom. We'll also do egress training at Building 9 out at Johnson Space Center for events out of the vehicle. On-orbit sims I already talked about, and then you can see at the bottom left is landing, or I guess your bottom right, the landing and recovery rehearsals. We've been doing that out at White Sands and getting ready for the first flight. Crew training, you see a lot of pictures. Here's the first crew, so you can see Chris Ferguson is the one on the first, one's on the left, and then Nicole Mann is the ones in the middle, and then Mike Fink, who joined our crew about, I want to say 6-7 months ago. And then the next flight crew is Sonny Williams and Josh Casada. So those are the next set that will fly on the first operational mission shortly after our crew test flight. So we're currently in crew training and crew operations. Like I said, last time I ran to Chris was about a week ago. He was down at JSC in Building 9 going through several training events. And so I'll end with that. Like I said, our focus is really on getting up there and once again providing capability from U.S. soil to put astronauts up on space station. We're really looking forward. This is going to be an exciting end of the year with a lot of activity going for us. The one thing I say is, we are flying a true operational vehicle up to station for our test flight coming up in October. That vehicle will be refurbished and used on the first crewed flight mission, so it is a full flight article. And so it's, when you start testing, we test like we fly. That's what we say. And so what you're seeing is the real thing of what we will fly crew on. So thank you.
Great. All right. Well, thank you, Peter. I appreciate that. Outstanding work, obviously, being done by all the companies to bring commercial space flight, human space flight into a reality. We have a couple of questions coming in, so we'll go into the Q&A phase of our panel discussion now. I'll start with one of my own. Peter, you mentioned the integrated testing piece being one of the challenges. To all of the panelists, I want to ask if you could summarize in terms of maybe your top three. What are your top three challenges that you face in bringing your vehicles online? And we can start with Peter.
Okay, I always say the number one challenge is closing the design, which I think everything's pretty much done if you're into the production phase. Number two is, as part of that, is demonstrating the design, so validating your models and making sure you understand what you have. And that's why you do all the testing that you do. The third challenge I'd say is transitioning from what I would say is first unit production to getting to a more of a production run, or actually getting to a flight set of production. And that to me is a significant challenge that you run into, because the panel before us was talking about SLS. When you're checking out all that equipment the first time, it's the same thing on crew. You have new tooling and new systems that are designed for rates that are probably not 10 or 12 a year. They're designed for more like 1 to 2, maybe 3 a year. And so checking out that tooling and validating it and getting it working is what really drives the program. So I'd say if you look in the phases, I'd say it's the design, the testing, and then the transition to production.
Yeah. I can look at we have a lot of vehicles we're working on. We got Falcon 9, we got Falcon Heavy, we got Starship, we got Crew Dragon. So if I narrowly focus this on Crew Dragon, I would say finishing up the vehicle tests and getting it ready, certified for human spaceflight is certainly one of the bigger challenges. If I treat this more as a generic question on what's typically on vehicle development, my answer would have been propulsion. Seems to be always the long pole, making propulsion system safe and tested out is something that is wise to start earlier rather than later. Of course, there's always some integration in the end where you have other long poles, but propulsion tends to be a long pole. That's why we probably dedicate entire conferences to it. And then, the day is only so short and the year is so short, and schedules and budgets are always in a certain fight. I want to say, on the human spaceflight vehicles in particular, budget and schedule has to step back before reliability. That's my job too. Reliability over basically all of the others, but I don't want to dismiss budget and schedule, obviously, as one of the challenges in human spaceflight.
Yeah, well, having mentioned that, Hans, you guys had an incident in April with the Dragon vehicle, so maybe could you elaborate a little bit on kind of where things are with that and how that ties into your readiness to move forward with Demo 2?
Right, yeah, so we basically reported right back on that day what happened, and then we had another press conference about a month ago where we reported back what the true problem is. It happens to be a combination of NTO, the oxidizer we're using, and some of the pressures we're using, and some details in the system design. Something that is relatively easy in terms of hardware to fix, but it has it was something that did surprise us overall. It was not something we inspected, given that NTO and MMH is the fuel. It's been used in many spacecraft all over the place. But we found something that is basically I don't want to say new vulnerability, but it is something that you have to be careful about, and obviously something you have to be particularly consider if you fly humans on those systems. And all of those human systems use mostly NTO and MMH, with a couple exceptions, obviously. So we worked through this anomaly at this point. I think we are largely writing it together as a report. We have a bunch of corrective actions that we will work prior to the first flight, and I feel actually, in some sense, when you have things like that happening, I feel like there's some amount, as bad as it sounds, it's a blessing in disguise to some extent, because you find it out earlier. You find it out when you do a ground test, and it's also important to notice that this was a ground test, a static fire test, basically, where sometimes things happen, and so you want to find that out at that time and not later when you fly humans. So I feel overall we're almost ready to tie a bow around it. We need a couple more lines on the fault tree that we need to run down. It's very systematic. It's a slow process, but overall I'm optimistic that we get this done before the next month, basically. And talking about the schedules here too a little bit, we have the in-flight abort test coming up too. That's supposed to be October, November timeframe, and then right after that, hopefully this year, we have the Demo 2 flight coming up. Demo 2 is basically the similar flight like we did with Demo 1 in March, only now with people.
Good, thanks.
Astronaut.
Top challenges, Chris.
So I'll copy a little bit. From the photos that I showed there, we are heavy in the transition from the design phase to the assembly, integration, and test phase. So this is kind of that moment where you figure out if you thought of everything, if everything fits together. Testing early, finding those earlier failures, as my colleagues have mentioned up here, definitely something that we are working through and is a challenge, just getting everything to work. It's a complex vehicle. It's not trivial to have something re-enter and then be reused 15 times and make it reliable. I would say another challenge that we have is, I mentioned earlier, we're very focused on being able to kind of grow our network of where the vehicle can land. And so this is more on the regulatory side, and something that's dear to my heart is working through those different challenges. And I think for all of us here, as our cadence increases, launch rates, reentry rates, those kind of things, there's more and more compression now on our airspace system. And so there's starting to be a lot of conflicts between airline schedules, spacecraft schedules, who wants access to these areas. And so we're working with the FAA, making sure that our vehicle integrates into that system as seamlessly as possible. But there are challenges and hazards around space flight that we want to keep aviation away from. So that's definitely a challenge, but I think we're working through it, and we're have a lot of creative ideas on the table as a community or as an industry. So that's good. I think there was two, but I'll leave it there.
I'm surprised to hear you mention that regulatory could be a challenge. But anyway, well, while you're on you, Chris, so let's talk international a little bit. You guys have any plans for international locations for Dream Chaser operations?
Absolutely. So we're very interested in growing our network. As we start to transition from, the cargo variant to the vehicle, and we look at the future of adding crew to the vehicle, as part of, we talked a lot with the SLS panel earlier, the abort capability, those kind of things. So we definitely need abort capability on the vehicle on ascent, and always aborting back to the United States is not necessarily feasible when you're orbiting the Earth. So we're definitely looking to grow that network, if you will, of landing sites to be able to support, an abort type capability. But for our commercial focus as well on the cargo version of the vehicle, which we have product lines that go into like a free-flying version of the vehicle that doesn't go to space station, but maybe goes up, conducts orbiting science for a month or some kind of manufacturing platform on orbit. We want to be able to be rapidly responsive to our customers' needs. So if they have some place they want to bring those products back to, or a laboratory that's near a particular runway somewhere in the world, we want to be able to land and integrate fairly seamlessly into that system. So absolutely something that we're interested in.
Great, thank you. So let's talk about pros and cons of landing crewed vehicles on land versus sea. So I'd like to turn to Peter and Hans. Pros and cons, landing on land versus landing in sea crewed vehicles. What are your thoughts?
So I guess I'll start with landing on land, then I'll let Hans talk about landing at water or on sea. I'll tell you, what's unique is we've had a look at both, because I said our primary thing is landing on land, but we have to look at landing at sea for the case we have to abort. And I'll tell you, freak waves is a concern when you land at sea, not to mention water intrusion risk, as well as saltwater contamination and corrosion. So there's a couple things when you look at, especially if you're trying to reuse a capsule, you don't want your avionics anywhere near salt water. It's not a good day. And so when we looked at reusability, it definitely drove us to look at land landing. Not to mention, the nice thing about land landing is access to the crew is near immediate, or much more immediate than even landing in the water. So there's a lot of benefits. I'll tell you history, though. We have landed in water, too. I mean, we worked Apollo way back in the day. And it's something that's pretty well known, so you can work with it. But for like us, I said the trade was we wanted to reuse the vehicles, so we said landing on land makes a lot more sense.
So I guess the key thing actually is propulsive landing, if you ask me. And that's what we do for our first stages for the boosters, because then you have the ability to land on land and sea without any water contamination. And then also you're independent of the gravity, or less dependent on the gravity field itself, so you can land on Moon and Mars at the same time. So I feel like that is the long-term goal. Landing on water is obviously an intermediate step, and it is a safe choice to some extent, because your abort is likely to be on water anyway. So it gives you a fair amount of landing options over this entire planet, rather, and it is a fairly, I don't want to downplay it, but it is a relatively simple solution, and the simpler solutions are, the safer they are typically. But like I said, in the long run, propulsive landing is definitely something that allows you to land on Moon and Mars, and therefore they're largely a requirement. Now, I do want to point out, we have been able to make Dragon reusable, despite the fact that it lands in water. We've flown Dragon up to 3 times. The last Dragon, and that's Cargo Dragon, obviously. Cirrus 18 was a third flight of a Dragon, so it's something that I didn't really mention previously, but it is something that we've been doing for many years by now, flying Dragon again. And part of that challenge, obviously, is to keep water out of the service modules and the critical base and within Dragon, and we've been successful in doing that over time. It's something that came step by step, but by now we are able to refurbish Dragon pretty quickly and fly it again, and the same will be happening for Crew Dragon, although I think there's no flight planned right now with a refurbished Crew Dragon, yeah.
Sure.
It's something that needs to be worked out.
Any perspective, Chris?
I would say that wheels don't do great in water, so we definitely prefer a runway specifically on land. But for us, just talking about challenges, I mean, there's an inherent benefit to the ocean in the sense that it's remote. And part of our charter with licensing our vehicles and our operations is ensuring public safety. And so the further away you can be from the general public, the safer they will inherently be. But so as you start talking about integrating vehicles closer and closer to land or onto land and landing on runways, then you start bringing in, further, more robust analysis looking at what are the potential impacts if there was a failure scenario on reentry or on launch. So there's work that you have to do there to make sure that you design your system properly, you understand the failure modes, and that you mitigate those as best as you can to ensure that we're meeting our regulatory requirements for public safety.
Great. Thank you, gentlemen. So just continuing with the theme of challenges, if you will, what unexpected challenges, and this is to all the panel members, what unexpected challenges have you encountered during the human rating process for your vehicles?
So I guess I'll start again. Yeah, and this, by the way, I would say I'd shared pretty openly with NASA too, and it's a good lesson learned as we look into the next activities we're going to do. One of the biggest challenges, I think, was when you look at how Commercial Crew was structured, you were allowed to bid alternate standards and alternate ways of doing things. And as you go through the process, I mean, we're going through safety reviews, I'm sure my cohorts at SpaceX are as well. And we still have some open alternate standards that haven't quite closed yet. And so as part of this, if you're going to get into a human rating discussion, you really need to have a clear set of requirements and alternate standards approved kind of at the SDR phase, early on in the process, because that's when you define how you're going to verify or how you're going to certify your vehicle for flight. And that goes into the design. And so if you're still debating that as you're coming up to first flight, that's not where you want to be. You want to have that closed early on so that you have agreement as you get into the safety review process that you know what's going to be or how it's going to be certified. I would say to me that's probably the one I'd pick.
Yeah, I think on the technical side, the NTO issue was a surprise to some extent. There's obviously the certification and basically this is a work shoulder to shoulder with NASA, so it is something where we had to build relationships and make sure that we understand things the right way, resolve the critical items as early as possible so you don't run down this path and then you find out this is something that is not quite the way we want it. So there are a couple of those items basically, but I think overall this played out pretty well, and I think we are at a phase now where we are wrapping things up and trying to get to the end game. So overall, I feel like more optimistic about that than initially. It was a mountain of work in the beginning, and you just chip away, and now it's just a little bit left at this point in time.
I would say similar to your requirements comment, Peter, about making sure you have those solidified. I think what we've found in our interactions with stakeholders beyond NASA, as well as everybody has kind of a specific focus or something that they're worried about on a particular item or design feature of a vehicle. So it's one, kind of aggregating all those and understanding what, historically has happened that has led to people to have those concerns and make sure that it's all managed appropriately. But yeah, I think it was surprising to us just, how many drivers there are out there that drive the design and perspectives that are out there and experience that's out there.
Great. So this next question will probably be a little challenging for all of you. I'll admit that up front. But whose space suits are the coolest?
I'm agnostic.
I guess it's ours.
All right.
Yeah, the Sokol suits. No, I'm kidding. Yeah, I think we both would say ours are probably.
You could have a runway.
All right. Okay, we'll leave it at that. Okay. Well, let's talk a little bit about Starship, Hans. How is Falcon and how are Falcon and Dragon informing development of Starship?
Yeah, I guess that's a really good question. One thing that we want to do is we clearly want to innovate, yeah? And it's hard to innovate in this industry. I'm not sure what it is, but there's obviously there's a certain amount of resistance to continuous innovation. So the easier way is to have a new development at the same time while you still have a reliable product flying at the same time. So we have Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy, Crew Dragon and Cargo Dragon. Those are flying with the exception of Crew Dragon really needs to have the crew on board. But Falcon 9 obviously is a reliable launcher at this point in time, and so is Falcon Heavy. So we keep the business side of that running. We learn a lot how we fly and how we reuse, how we refurbish vehicles, and it gives us an enormous opportunity to test things, to test a new material during a re-entry. We put a little patch on Cargo Dragon, and then that's the new material, and then we look at it when it comes back. So that obviously flows into a Starship. That's obviously one thing. The other thing is we're trying constantly to find new solutions, better solutions, and that's almost where Starship is the precursor. We test those new things on Starship, and they may flow back into the other system at one point in time. Yeah. So I feel like it's a very healthy. It makes a very healthy company to keep on one side a reliable product line running, and on the other side an innovative branch. Or an innovative department, basically, that builds a next generation launch vehicle that is then capable to return both the first stage and the second stage, which is obviously then the holy grail in terms of reusability and keeping your launch cost really at a low point. Mm-hmm.
Good. Well, let's stay on Starship for a little bit more, Hans. So what's the status, timeline, and plan for missions to the Moon and Mars, Starship?
So I think the timing in terms of Moon and Mars, I want to point out in terms of Artemis and the ongoing projects, we have Falcon Heavy there as the product, being able to provide cargo services to Artemis, and obviously Falcon 9 will soon be able to provide crew too. So we have that side of the business, and when we phase in the other side of the new vehicles, it is in line right now with that time frame. Mm-hmm. But I also want to point out these time frames are dependent obviously on resources, how much resources we can put in. The more resources we have available, the faster we can bring Starship online and be in that time frame. We are targeting a more progressive hops and hops means up and down, basically suborbital at Boca Chica, and then we're targeting an early orbital launch as soon as possible. Those are challenges to us as the engineers and to us as a company from Elon directly, basically. And people take this very serious. They work very hard to make sure that we can fly as soon as possible. So, but I want to be a little bit cautious here, and just say I can guarantee you these people work as fast as they can. We will beat any other time schedule that's out there. but I still don't want to provide a.
All right, okay, great. All right, we'll let you come up for a little water here, Hans. So we'll turn to Peter now. So Peter, which launch vehicles beyond Atlas and presumably Vulcan will Starliner be able to use?
Well, so our baseline's Atlas, and that's what we're carrying through our initial mission phase. I think we're still in a trade space. Vulcan's probably an easy transition since it's using a common Centaur-based upper stage, but and probably can reuse a lot of the avionics that we did for our emergency detection system, the EDS. So I think that's probably a natural transition. It doesn't preclude us from looking at other alternatives as well, especially depending on what flight rate is needed and availability. So we haven't really ruled anything out, but we are probably leaning more towards the Vulcan at this point.
Okay, good enough. Christopher, have you begun to look at planetary versions of life for Moon and Mars surface missions?
Absolutely. So with the baseline design that we have right now is very focused on cislunar, but we have a lot of variants or branches of that technology that could focus on LEO, lunar, Mars, and we have some studies right now with NASA where we're looking at potentially taking that technology down to the surface of either of the celestial bodies I just mentioned.
Okay, good. Sticking with life here a little bit. Let's find the question. How tolerant is life to space debris? Can it withstand impacts from space debris?
Absolutely. So that's a key piece of the risk profile that we're looking at in the development of that platform. As you saw from the photos, it is an inflatable, and there are a lot of questions around inflatable technology and MMOD, micrometeorite impacts. So there are certain design evolutions that we're going through right now that basically puts layers upon layers of shielding on the outside that still allow us to get the benefits of being able to pack confinedly in a launch vehicle and then inflate and deploy on orbit and give us substantially larger volumes than you can with rigid structures inside of fairings. But we are looking very heavily at the MMOD protection and the shielding that we have there, and there's a wealth of data now that's starting to aggregate. I think as previously mentioned, as you build this database, and I'm not speaking just as a company, but as an industry as well, where you start to pursue these technologies, there's tests done across the industry, knowledge, and then conferences like this where those results are shared, that you start to get some inertia and understanding how these systems work, and it benefits everybody.
Yeah. While we're talking about debris a little bit, I'm just curious from all of you, recently we through presidential policy directive, we've put in place now, at least from the executive branch standpoint, a civil space traffic management construct, if you will. How critical is civil space traffic management to your operations?
So I'll go ahead and start. And by the way, I started my career doing hypervelocity impact testing down at JSC. So I remember when we added Nextel fibers into the conversation versus metallic plates. So it's a lot of fun talking materials. But when you look at space traffic management, and also one of my prior jobs, I actually worked on space-based space surveillance, which is actually one of the satellites being used to track a lot of things in orbit today. Yeah. It's significantly important because you look at every launch that happens, you look at space station operations even, understanding, part of it's understanding the actual assets that are in orbit. The other part of it is trying to track the debris that's been created or exists in orbit. Micrometeorites maybe not so much, a little harder to track that. But you have COLAs every time you launch today for something coming overhead. And I'll make a comment and this is just from my background. I'll tell you the thing that makes me most nervous, and I'm going to counter some people for a minute, is mega constellations in LEO. And part of that is because I also work space station. That flies in and around, I'd say 100 kilometers south of where these constellations all want to go. Mm-hmm. And you're going to put thousands of satellites up there, which, by the way, is going to create COLA nightmares for launches. But on top of that, those satellites come down sometime. And the question is whether they're controlled when they come down or not. And it's going to put a lot of strain on operating in LEO below that constellation belt. And so I think, yes, I think it's very important that we understand what's up there and we're able to track it, or else we're going to create, I always joke, I think I ran a launch piece of a constellation program once, and I had a sign outside my wall that was from WALL-E. I don't know if you remember the movie WALL-E. And they had to bust through that layer of junk to get out into space, and I had that up there just as a joke, hey, just remember that when we start talking about this.
Yeah, I think if you run constellations, you have to have your own system that either interacts with other traffic management systems, basically, or takes data from them and actively moves your satellites around. And obviously, the orbiting satellites that are defunctional or will run out of propellant soon is critical, as is a reliable propulsion system, obviously. So clearly, it's a critical thing for that. For launches itself, and yes, we do have collars, and it's a critical thing to, fly around the station, and I think it's primarily the station. But I always wondered a little bit why we worry about the first 3 hours, and then after that, totally on your own, right? One thing that I do want to point out is whenever we can, we deorbit the second stage. That is something that I think is critically important too. And if you can't, you make sure that you save it and don't leave any kind of energy, chemical or electrical in the vehicle. So those are traditional standard methods that help, obviously. But yeah, I guess that's my main message.
Yeah, I would say, the debate kind of focuses around two concepts. There's STM, space traffic management, and then there's space situational awareness, SSA. And so one is the perceiving and knowledge of where things are, and the other one's the action to do something about it. But, to the question about, a civil version of this, I think there's strong motivation, at least within our company, and I think other companies as well, to be able to control that process a little bit more, have more access to it, maybe get a stream of that data, and then be able to, downstream from the data source, look at it for our own purposes. Hans was talking about if you have a constellation of satellites, being able to make your own decisions about how you maneuver those based off of a common data set. And so from a civil focus versus a DoD focus, I think the intent is different about what the larger mission is. And I think for a lot of us, doing a COLA, those kind of things, if the DoD is performing it, that's probably a secondary mission to what they're primarily focusing on. And so there's timelines associated with that will start to compete as launch rates, reentry rates increase. So having a civil version that's motivated with a different mission set, I think would be beneficial.
Let's talk about launch rates for a minute, and this is to all of you. How high a launch rate for people do you all see? Is there much cost benefit to different rate levels, like 1 per year, 3 per year, or what's your optimistic view? We can start with you, Chris.
Yeah, I would say for us initially, we want to do 1 to 2 flights per year, probably for the first 3 years, so through mid-2020 timeframe. And then from there, we'd like to get up to a flight rate of 5 flights a year. And then from there, it'll kind of see what the market is bearing at that point in terms of resupply. And there's a lot of questions right now, the buzzword right now, post-ISS. So, when the decision is made to move off of the ISS platform, are we talking multiple LEO stations that need servicing? Are we talking multiple destinations, singular destination, no destination, and we have a series of free flyers that go up on orbit and then come back? So a lot of these questions, I think, will dictate, at least for us, what those flight rates look like.
I'm not sure I can actually answer this off the top of my head, because I know this from the satellite side, and I did notice that when you launch once a month, you get not as proficient as when you launch once a week. Yeah, and then if you launch every 3 or 4 days, that's probably stressing the system a little bit too much. Yeah. So depending on how you're set up, there's a sweet spot where the machine is humming, and it's doing this in a safe way. It's repetitive. It's really great, and you get very proficient with that. The same is true for flying, by the way, too, right? If I don't practice my landing every other week, but I go every other month, they're not going to be great. So there's some similarity. So for people, for astronauts, for human spaceflight, I'm not sure where the sweet spot is, but I'm pretty sure it's at a higher flight rate than currently planned. So I feel like filling in commercial flights at the same time is a good thing in that sense. It makes the overall system more proficient and therefore more safer. Obviously, there's the other end of it where it becomes a little bit like critical and you're now hasty, and this, so you have to hit the sweet spot according to your resources. And I would definitely say it's more than what's currently planned. The current resources, I would probably going to go for once a month, something like that, yeah, and think that's probably a sweet spot. But it really depends on what kind of environment and resources you have on the company side that does this.
Yeah, while we're talking with you, Hans, so let's just talk about Falcon 9. Typically, how many reflights for a Falcon 9, and what are they?
I think we had 25 on the chart. That's basically for all the fleet that we have right now. We're going to go to 10, possibly even more, depending on what we see. At 10, we have a life leader, basically, and take a look at that vehicle and keep on testing it between the flights to make sure that it's capable to fly. We will have an opportunity pretty soon to push the number of reflights up, and I'm looking forward to get those data and to get a better idea on what's technically possible. In theory or on paper, we know that we are beyond 10. You know, we have those numbers. It's basically fracture control at one end of the reliability curve. But in practice, obviously, you want to see what the reentry does and then also what environmental factors like salt water and other stuff does to your vehicle. So we're at 3 right now. We're pretty soon going to 4, and then from then on, it's going to be constantly going up. I can tell you, it's a new experience for me to have a fleet and not just a rocket. And I mean, they have tail numbers, and you look at the tail number and go, which one was that again? And I look it up and I go, oh, okay, it's these 3 flights, and it's a really interesting phenomenon when you suddenly come from a single rocket use into something that has tail numbers, and you have a history on this vehicle. It's pretty amazing to do this and to find out what this vehicle has done and what it has done reliably, and it's an extremely steep learning curve.
Yeah. Peter.
So you want the production rate, or what?
Yeah, let's go back to launch rates for people. What do you see, and any cost benefits to varying those rates?
So right now, we're on contract. I think the NASA baseline is to try to fly us in alternating paths. So we're both on contract for about 1 a year for crew. We've got a capability to fly at least twice a year if we want to. We're looking at a commercial market and seeing if there's a way to definitely increase the use of station. There's opportunities where you could do that potentially with a full flight. Our vehicle is also, it's designed for 4 NASA astronauts. Like I think both of us have that as a requirement. We have the unique capability to actually put a 5th in if we want. And so we're looking at marketing that, see it as an opportunity to grow the market. Our thought is, hey, if you're really wanting to open a commercial market, then let every opportunity play that has a potential commercial opportunity. And so there may be some unique things we can do with our 5th seat that might be beneficial to both NASA and commercial markets. And then we're looking at commercially flying up to 6 people. I think we can do on a single mission for a short period, maybe at some point as well. So, we're looking at it from a NASA perspective, but this is a public-private partnership. So the idea of going in and it's in the contract this way. It gives us the rights to use it for commercial use, like 5th seat is in the contract. So we have a right to do that. So we're looking at how to expand the market and grow the launch rates and use it more.
Yeah, well, that's kind of where I wanted to go next. What happens post ISS? What are your plans? You have any design plans for potentially future space stations aside from ISS? But what are you thinking?
Let me start with one comment, which is we need to learn from our history and not pull another shuttle, where we actually end something before we have something else there, because there is a need in LEO, and space station is probably the best incubator you could have to actually spawn a LEO economy and let it grow. And if you pull station out before that happens, you probably crater the market and you don't have anything. And so one thing we need to do is learn from that. So we shouldn't be abandoning station until we have something else there that can perform the function. And oh, by the way, like I said, I worked station. Matter of fact, that was my first job. I worked S1, P1 in the cupola. But you know, it can last to 2030 and beyond if that's what NASA wants. So it's got the capacity. And I'd say as one of a commercial public-private partnership that was banking on actually getting a return on this business at some point, pulling that out from under us is not a good example of what you want at a public-private partnership. Otherwise, you're not going to get future ones. So definitely providing a capability there is important. I think there are folks looking, or a couple of companies looking at bringing up additional habitation modules and other things, and I know we've been looking at that as well. I think the issue right now is NASA is the primary customer, and we haven't seen enough commercial market that would pull it otherwise. So to make that happen, I think NASA's going to still have to be the primary tenant on it. There is commercial on the fringe, but not at the level it would subsidize the entire effort.
Yeah, I think I'm also a little bit in denial in terms of the ISS. I mean, not just selfishly in terms of job, but I really think I've learned it's an international asset. It's a stepping stone to Moon and Mars, in my opinion. It's where we learn things. There's a lot of cool science on it too, no question about it. But I always saw, when I started working on it, I saw the real value much better than before. And getting these 6 astronauts, or whatever the number is at the time, up there, feed them, keep them happy, bring them up and down, and have them work there is an incredible achievement and really an amazing thing. I don't even want to think about it. We one day don't do that anymore. Yeah? But I think we did a great job on the station. Should make sure that we can keep this running as long as possible, and not pull it out. Yeah.
Yeah, I would echo the comment too about learning from history and making sure that we have a transition plan that's executable and that we have technology in place before we decide to retire current technology. I think from our perspective and the studies that we've done, and our focus area is we see kind of a diversified LEO instead of one. In the long future, instead of one asset up there, maybe a host of different assets that have different capabilities, whether it's in-space manufacturing, a science-type platform, something that has human presence on it. I mean, some of the limitations today are there are maybe certain manufacturing things that you would want to do in space, or science-type experiments that you'd want to do, but that conflicts with the fact that we have humans on board station right now, and that poses potential risk to them. So there is opportunities if you have a non-human, more autonomous type platform to open up the aperture for other industries that maybe wouldn't necessarily consider using space right now because of the human component. So I think there's a lot of options. You see NASA right now, with a lot of different solicitations, the appendices under the Next Step programs, that I think they're putting a lot of feelers out there to try and kind of figure out where maybe some of these commercial markets are. But I would say right now, from what we've seen, that completely pulling out on station and saying, okay, commercial, you've got this. I don't think the subsidy is there or the investment and the money is there to make up for the subsidy that we're getting right now from the government.
Any thought on how commercial transport will facilitate space economy apart from NASA?
I'm not sure I understand the question, sorry.
So how will commercial space transport facilitate the space economy apart from NASA? So much of the discussion has been with NASA as a customer, but NASA, considering NASA out of the picture, if you will, how does it work?
Yeah, I would say, cost is one of the major drivers here. So continuing to get the costs lower makes the barrier to entry for commercial enterprise more approachable. I would also say that I don't know that NASA or any of the other, government partners on an international stage can ever be completely out of the business. But I think there's a model out there where they are a customer among many other customers for services. So they pay by the drink versus be the sole, funding source for these future economies.
Yeah, I think I would echo that too. I mean, I want to keep the head down right now and get to the, crew flight. Demo 2 is the next flight. We want to do that. Make sure we get this done and then get into the operational phase and start providing this service to the space station. And then I feel like the next step is probably looking at some sort of tourism one day or the other. And obviously it's going to happen. I hope it's going to be fast enough so I can use it one day. But no, this is first we got to get to Demo 2 and get this done.
Well, that was a question, but anyway, we'll come back to that later. But anyway, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, so the only thing, I'll take it from not a supply side, but more of a demand side. There is demand out there. It's just not at the level I think people think can consume all of the cost today. We are seeing demand, especially, I'd say the number one demand you see is probably private passengers or private astronauts. There's interest from, I'd say, non-15 nations that are on station. There's interest of actually growing into a spacefaring nation, right, at a national level. There's also, Space Adventures has flown 7 passengers 8 times up to station already on the Russian side. And I know they've got some contracts in work for flying some additional ones on Soyuz. But there's definitely demand, or there is some demand, albeit in the teens, not in the hundreds or thousands yet, right? But the way you grow that is to at least start opening up the opportunity for more to come. So I think that's probably the number one market growth opportunity there. When you get beyond that, a good example of the manufacturing space is another good one. Main Space was pulling microfibers, I forget, Z-Bland, up in space, and they're looking at pure crystal, or taking the crystals out of the pure fiber, so you get high data rate for like banking and other purposes. And you're right, I've heard like microchips was another one, but it's toxic. So they look at how maybe that market may grow. A lot of that you can incubate on station and see if it's real and do the testing, and then you have an opportunity to maybe grow that market share too. So there is a little bit of the supply side you're seeing, although I'd say it's more in the infant type maturity right now. But we need to continue to look at that and use station in a way to actually mature that.
Okay. Well, I think that's a great place to maybe pause and end this discussion. This has been a great conversation that we've had over the last hour or so. We're a little bit out of time now. I know you still have some more questions out there, and these guys, I'm sure, will be available at the break. You can ask them more questions. But I want to thank you all for taking part in the discussion. I think this has been informative, and we really look forward to the future. And hopefully one day we all can take that wonderful flight into space aboard one of these vehicles. So with that, I want to thank you all for your time.
Thank you.